January 1944. A cold, cloud-filled sky stretches endlessly above the Eastern Front. The hum of engines fills the air as German bombers cut through the mist, unaware of the approaching danger. Far above, hidden in the clouds, American P-47 Thunderbolts wait like predators, engines humming with a deep, menacing growl. The Luftwaffe pilots, expertly trained in the art of aerial combat, feel the familiar tension in their chests as they peer into the gray expanse, scanning for any sign of enemy aircraft. Then, without warning, a shadow looms, too late to react. The first flash of fire and the deafening roar of machine guns break through the fog. A thunderbolt strikes from above, as if the heavens themselves had opened to unleash destruction. For the German pilots, this is not the first encounter with the Thunderbolt, but it is the first time they feel true fear, a fear that comes from knowing, all too well, that the enemy is watching from above, where they cannot reach. In an instant, the battlefield shifts. The Thunderbolt has arrived. It was early 1944, and the skies over Europe were an unforgiving battlefield. The Luftwaffe, once the dominant air force, had been severely weakened by years of Allied bombing campaigns and an increasingly dire strategic situation. The German Air Force had suffered devastating losses in the Battle of Britain, the North African Campaign, and the ongoing conflict on the Eastern Front. By the time the Allies launched Operation Overlord in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer the fearsome entity it had once been. For the Luftwaffe pilots who still took to the skies, the war had become a brutal contest of survival. The introduction of American fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, had already begun to turn the tide in favor of the Allies. But the P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft that had a reputation for its brute strength, speed, and resilience, would soon emerge as a terrifying new force in the air. The Thunderbolt's reputation preceded it, and as it roared into the skies over Europe, it changed the nature of aerial combat. The Thunderbolt had been developed by the United States Army Air Force, USAAF, as a heavy fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. Unlike its predecessors, the P-47 was built for durability, with a robust frame and powerful engine that allowed it to take on both bombers and fighters. The aircraft's 850 caliber machine guns could unleash a torrent of bullets that could devastate enemy aircraft in seconds. But it was the Thunderbolt's ability to dive from above the clouds with devastating force that made it a fearsome adversary for the Luftwaffe pilots. The Allies had been using the Thunderbolt in various theaters of war, but it was in the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe that it truly made its mark. In the face of overwhelming odds, the P-47's presence in the air would become a nightmare for the Germans. With the Luftwaffe struggling to maintain control, the Thunderbolt, often deployed in high-altitude surprise attacks, became one of the most feared American fighters in the European theater. For the first time, German pilots found themselves vulnerable to an enemy that could strike from above the clouds, a position they had once dominated. The P-47 Thunderbolt was designed with one primary goal: to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and protect them from enemy fighters. This was no small task. By 1944, the Allies had perfected the strategy of heavy bombing raids over Germany and Nazi-occupied territories, and the Luftwaffe was under immense pressure to defend its airspace. But the German air forces were stretched thin, their resources depleted. The P-47, however, was a formidable answer to the growing threat. The Thunderbolt's design was the result of years of engineering experimentation, powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine. The P-47 was equipped with a 2,000-horsepower engine, giving it a maximum speed of over 430 mph. It was heavily armored, with reinforced glass and steel plating to protect both the pilot and critical components of the aircraft. This made the P-47 less maneuverable than its lighter counterparts, But it compensated for this with sheer firepower and durability. One of the most distinct features of the P-47 was its armament. The aircraft was armed with 8 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the wings. Each of these guns could unleash a deadly storm of bullets, making the Thunderbolt an absolute terror when it encountered enemy aircraft. But the Thunderbolt was not just a fighter, it was also a ground attack aircraft. Its ability to dive into targets with precision, using its heavy guns to destroy enemy vehicles, tanks, and infrastructure, made it an all-around menace. However, it was the aircraft's capability to operate at high altitudes and then suddenly swoop down from the clouds that terrified the Luftwaffe pilots. German pilots, who had long dominated the high skies, found themselves vulnerable to an adversary that could strike with little warning. The P-47's high-speed dives from the clouds became its trademark tactic, catching enemy aircraft off guard and devastating them before they had a chance to react. On the other side, the Luftwaffe was struggling. The once proud German Air Force had been worn down by years of attrition. The intense Allied bombing campaigns had obliterated much of the Luftwaffe's infrastructure, and its pilots faced constant shortages of fuel, aircraft, and morale. German fighter planes, particularly the Bf-109 and the Fw-190, were still formidable in their own right, but they were no match for the Thunderbolt's superior firepower and sheer endurance. For many Luftwaffe pilots, the appearance of the Thunderbolt was a reminder of the changing nature of the war. Once, it had been their fighters that dominated the skies over Europe. But now, they were being hunted. They could no longer rely on their speed and maneuverability alone. The P-47 had arrived, and with it, a new kind of terror. For the Luftwaffe pilots, the appearance of the P-47 Thunderbolt from above the clouds was unlike anything they had encountered before. These pilots, many of whom had survived the worst of the aerial battles over Europe, were now facing a new enemy that seemed to defy all expectations. The Thunderbolt's sheer power and ferocity in battle left them with a unique sense of fear. A fear not just of the enemy, but of the very unpredictability that the Thunderbolt introduced into aerial combat. German pilots had been trained to anticipate the behavior of their enemies. The P-51 Mustang was fast and deadly, but it operated in ways the Luftwaffe could understand. The Thunderbolt, however, was different. It could strike from high altitudes, diving from the clouds with little warning, and it had the firepower to tear through enemy formations in seconds. When a Thunderbolt appeared in the skies, German pilots could do little but watch in terror as it closed in from above, its guns blazing. The psychological effect of these surprise attacks was immense. In the chaos of aerial combat, pilots needed to maintain a steady sense of control. But when the Thunderbolt descended from above, it was like an unseen predator that could strike from anywhere. For many German pilots, the fear of never knowing where the next attack would come from became paralyzing. It wasn't just the physical threat, it was the fear of being caught off guard, of not being able to react in time. This was a kind of warfare that they had not prepared for. The Thunderbolt's success was not only due to its raw power, but also the strategy employed by the American pilots. High-altitude attacks from above the clouds were the perfect way to gain the element of surprise, and the Thunderbolt excelled in this role. By staying hidden in the clouds until the last possible moment, Thunderbolt pilots could strike with near impunity, forcing German pilots to react quickly or risk being destroyed. In the skies over Europe, timing was everything. A moment's hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. Allied pilots would often wait until the last possible moment to break through the clouds and engage German aircraft. This sudden appearance, followed by a furious barrage of machine gun fire, created chaos within the ranks of the Luftwaffe. The German pilots, who were used to engaging enemies that they could see, were now faced with an enemy that seemed to appear out of nowhere, turning the rules of air combat on their head. Effectiveness of this strategy was magnified by the sheer resilience of the P-47. While other fighters would often be damaged or destroyed after diving into a fight, the Thunderbolt could absorb a surprising amount of punishment and still return to the fight. Its robust construction and powerful engine allowed it to engage multiple targets without losing its edge. In this way, the Thunderbolt wasn't just a surprise attacker. It was a relentless force that would keep coming back until the Luftwaffe was overwhelmed. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not just a product of innovative tactics, but a triumph of engineering. Its design, though unconventional at first glance, proved to be perfectly suited for the demands of long-range combat and high-intensity dogfights over Europe. The Thunderbolt's rugged construction set it apart from many of its contemporaries, allowing it to withstand tremendous punishment and still remain operational. At the heart of its success was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, a massive radial engine that powered the P-47 with more than 2,000 horsepower. This engine gave the aircraft a level of speed and endurance that few other planes could match, and it enabled the Thunderbolt to climb quickly to high altitudes, where it would wait, hidden in the clouds, for the perfect moment to strike. The Thunderbolt was also heavily armed. With 8 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, it was one of the most heavily armed single-engine fighters of the war. These guns could deliver a massive amount of firepower in a short burst, and they were capable of taking down not just enemy fighters, but bombers, vehicles, and ground installations. The Thunderbolt was also equipped with bombs and rockets, further enhancing its versatility. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a weapon of war in multiple forms. The aircraft's durability was another key factor that made it such a formidable opponent. Unlike more delicate fighters, the P-47 could take damage and keep flying. This toughness became a defining characteristic of the Thunderbolt, and it earned the respect and fear of its enemies. German pilots quickly realized that when they faced a Thunderbolt, they were not simply fighting an aircraft. They were up against a relentless machine capable of surviving even the most brutal combat scenarios. The introduction of the Thunderbolt into the skies over Europe didn't just force the Luftwaffe to adapt. It pushed the German high command into a corner. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had been battered by years of Allied raids, and the appearance of a new, powerful threat added to the pressure mounting on their air forces. The response to the P-47 was mixed, but it was clear that the Germans could not afford to underestimate this new menace. At first, the Luftwaffe tried to rely on traditional methods to deal with the Thunderbolt. Fighters like the Bf-109 and FW-190, which had been successful in previous engagements, were sent to intercept American bombers and fighters. However, these aircraft, while effective in certain situations, were often outclassed by the Thunderbolt's sheer firepower and survivability. The German pilots who took on the P-47 soon found themselves facing a much tougher adversary than they had anticipated. One of the most effective tactics that the Luftwaffe attempted was to engage Thunderbolts in combat at lower altitudes, where the Thunderbolt's advantages were minimized. However, this was often easier said than done. By the time the Luftwaffe pilots had identified a Thunderbolt in their midst, it was often too late. The American pilots, operating with superior tactics and the element of surprise, had already inflicted significant damage before the Germans could respond. As the war continued, the Luftwaffe was forced to adapt, but the sheer effectiveness of the Thunderbolt made countermeasures difficult to implement. German engineers began to focus on improving the performance of their fighters. But by the time they had developed counter-strategies, the Thunderbolt had already done much of the damage. The year 1944 marked a turning point in the skies over Europe. As the Allies ramped up their bombing campaigns, the Luftwaffe found itself increasingly on the defensive. The introduction of the P-47 Thunderbolt into the fray was a critical blow to the already weakened German air forces. The American fighters' ability to strike from above, diving down with overwhelming firepower, became a game-changer in the battle for supremacy in the skies. One of the most defining moments in this new phase of aerial combat occurred during the Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944. As German forces attempted to retreat, Allied bombers and their fighter escorts were deployed to cut off any escape routes. The P-47 Thunderbolts, operating at high altitudes and using the clouds as cover, provided critical air support. German bombers, already harassed by constant Allied raids, were now facing a new threat that they could neither anticipate nor defend against. For the German pilots caught in the midst of this, it was a harrowing experience. The P-47s swooped down from the clouds with terrifying speed and precision, their guns blazing. German pilots, who had been trained to fight on their own terms, were now forced into a defensive posture. Many reported hearing the thundering roar of the P-47s only moments before they were struck. Too late to respond. Too late to react. One notable encounter occurred during a mission over Normandy, where a squadron of Thunderbolts ambushed a formation of German bombers. The German pilots, already on edge from the relentless Allied raids, were unprepared for the sudden appearance of the Thunderbolts. As the American fighters dived from the clouds, they tore into the German bombers with a precision that left little room for escape. Within moments, several German bombers were reduced to burning wrecks, and the survivors scattered in confusion. The psychological impact on the German pilots was immense. Not only were they being physically overwhelmed, but they were also faced with an enemy that had completely changed the rules of air combat. The fear of being caught unawares, of having the enemy strike from above with no warning, left many pilots on edge. This moment marked the beginning of a shift in air combat tactics, as the Luftwaffe scrambled to adapt to a new threat that had already begun to dominate the skies. By the fall of 1944, the Thunderbolt had proven itself to be a decisive force in the air war. Its ability to engage targets with devastating firepower, combined with its resilience and surprise tactics, made it an instrument of both destruction and terror. The Luftwaffe, already struggling under the weight of mounting defeats on the ground, now had to contend with an adversary that could strike from above, with unparalleled ferocity. As the P-47 Thunderbolts began to dominate the skies over Europe, the true impact of their presence became increasingly clear. German pilots, who had once prided themselves on their superior flying skills, now found themselves constantly on the defensive. The Thunderbolts' high-altitude ambushes were not only tactically effective, but psychologically devastating. No longer could they predict when or where an attack might come. The very nature of aerial combat had shifted. One of the most pivotal engagements occurred during the campaign to liberate France. As the Allies advanced following the D-Day invasion, the Luftwaffe scrambled to slow the progress of Allied forces by engaging in desperate counterattacks. But wherever the Luftwaffe flew, the Thunderbolts were not far behind, waiting in the clouds. In one notable encounter over the skies of Brittany, a squadron of German fighters attempted to intercept a formation of Allied bombers. Unbeknownst to them, a group of Thunderbolts had already taken position above the clouds. As the German fighters dove to engage the bombers, the Thunderbolts pounced, cutting through the air like an unstoppable force. In moments, several German fighters were reduced to flaming wrecks, and the rest scattered in disarray. The attack was so swift and overwhelming that it left the remaining German pilots in shock. Many of them later recounted how the P-47s seemed to materialize from nowhere, descending from the clouds like angels of death. The idea that an enemy could strike from such a height with such speed and precision left the Luftwaffe struggling to regroup. This was no longer a battle for control of the skies, it was a battle of survival. The once feared Luftwaffe pilots now found themselves constantly outmaneuvered and outgunned. The Thunderbolt, with its powerful engines, heavy armor, and superior firepower, proved to be an insurmountable obstacle. For every German aircraft that attempted to engage, several would fall, while the Thunderbolt would return to base. often riddled with damage, but still fully capable of flying another mission. The psychological toll on the Luftwaffe was profound. By the fall of 1944, German pilots began to report a heightened sense of dread whenever they encountered American bombers. It wasn't just the bombers themselves that posed a threat. It was the Thunderbolts that escorted them. Unlike previous years, when German pilots had been able to target bombers with relative ease, the presence of the Thunderbolt now turned every bombing raid into a dangerous proposition. The psychological strain on German pilots increased with every mission. They were no longer fighting for air superiority. They were trying to survive. As the war continued to progress into 1945, the Thunderbolt's reputation spread throughout the Luftwaffe. German pilots knew that the American fighters could strike from above, from out of nowhere, with devastating results. The once proud Luftwaffe, which had once been able to dictate the terms of combat, now found itself struggling to cope with the new reality of high-altitude ambushes. The Thunderbolt had changed the course of air combat over Europe, leaving the Luftwaffe with little hope of regaining control of the skies. By the close of 1944, the scale of the P-47 Thunderbolt's impact was undeniable. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in Europe, had been severely weakened, and its pilots, demoralized by constant losses and the relentless tactics of the Thunderbolt, began to lose their will to fight. The psychological toll was staggering. German pilots, accustomed to striking from the advantage of the high skies, were now living in constant fear of the Thunderbolts that could appear without warning. The statistics spoke for themselves. The P-47 Thunderbolt had racked up impressive kills over the course of the war. By the time the Allies had pushed through France and were closing in on Germany, the Thunderbolts had accounted for the destruction of thousands of enemy aircraft, both fighters and bombers. The number of Luftwaffe aircraft lost in combat, coupled with the damage done to their infrastructure by Allied bombing campaigns, left the German Air Force scrambling to respond. The Luftwaffe was no longer able to provide meaningful air support for the ground forces in the same way it had in the earlier years of the war. In the crucial battles that would determine the fate of the Reich, the Luftwaffe was no longer an effective deterrent to Allied progress. The Allied victories in the autumn and winter of 1944 owed much to the dominance of the Thunderbolt in the skies. The aircraft's role as a bomber escort became indispensable, and its ability to adapt to both aerial combat and ground attacks allowed it to make a decisive impact on multiple fronts. The Thunderbolts made daylight bombing raids viable, offering protection to the heavy bombers that could now strike deep into the heart of Germany with little fear of Luftwaffe interception. For the Germans, the impact of the Thunderbolt was more than just a loss of planes. The psychological devastation was perhaps even more significant. After years of being the dominant force in the air, the Luftwaffe pilots were now faced with the reality that their once formidable advantage had been completely shattered. The fear that came with the Thunderbolt's surprise attacks from above demoralized many Luftwaffe pilots to the point where they began to question their effectiveness. The Luftwaffe's high command had no ready solution to the problem that the P-47 posed. It was not just the advanced technology of the Thunderbolt, but the tactics and morale of the American pilots that made it so effective. By the time the war reached its final months, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The P-47 Thunderbolt had not only destroyed German aircraft in the air, but had also played a significant role in undermining the Luftwaffe's ability to defend Germany's skies. The once feared German air forces were no longer able to effectively challenge the overwhelming air superiority of the Allies, and their struggle to keep pace with the American air assault became evident. The Thunderbolt's success had a profound effect on the course of the war. In addition to its victories in the air, the Thunderbolt's ground attack capabilities had also played a crucial role in the Allied push into Germany. With its ability to dive upon targets with precision, the Thunderbolt delivered devastating attacks on German supply lines, fuel depots, and military installations, further crippling the already struggling Nazi war machine. These attacks were essential in disrupting the German economy and weakening their logistical capabilities, which ultimately led to a slow collapse of their ability to resist the advancing Allied forces. In the skies, the Thunderbolt's ability to maintain air superiority over the Germans was a key factor in the success of the Allied campaigns in the European theater. The Luftwaffe, unable to adapt to the new tactics and technologies that the Thunderbolt had introduced, found itself caught in a losing battle against a more relentless and adaptable enemy. As the war drew to a close, many Luftwaffe pilots were left questioning how they could have countered the Thunderbolt's dominance. The answer, of course, was that they could not. The P-47 had changed the game. The Battle of the Bulge, fought in the winter of 1944-45, was one of the final standoffs between the Allies and the Germans, and the Thunderbolt's role in that battle further cemented its reputation. American fighters, including the P-47, played a pivotal role in repelling the German offensive. In this brutal, frigid campaign, the Thunderbolts tore into the German forces, providing air support that turned the tide of the battle in favor of the Allies. German aircraft, already outnumbered and outclassed, were no match for the P-47s, and the Luftwaffe was virtually destroyed as a fighting force in the West. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt was hailed as one of the most effective weapons of the Allied victory. Its design, firepower, and the innovative tactics it introduced had proven to be decisive in the defeat of Nazi Germany. The aircraft's ability to fight both in the air and on the ground, to survive in the face of overwhelming odds, and to strike fear into the hearts of German pilots made it a symbol of Allied air superiority. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt extends far beyond its role in the skies over Europe. It was more than just a powerful aircraft. It symbolized a shift in the nature of aerial warfare, where technology, strategy, and psychological factors became as decisive as raw firepower. The Thunderbolt's design, rugged, reliable, and lethal, embodied the adaptability and resilience that defined the American approach to the war. In a conflict marked by constant innovation, the Thunderbolt stood out as a testament to the importance of engineering in modern warfare. For the Luftwaffe, the fear instilled by the Thunderbolt was not just of an aircraft, but of a changing era in combat. The psychological toll it exacted on German pilots was profound, as they struggled to comprehend an enemy that could strike with such surprise, such force, from above the clouds. What was once a world in which the German pilots dominated the skies had become a world in which they were always at risk, always vulnerable to a new kind of warfare they had not anticipated. In many ways, the appearance of the Thunderbolt in the skies marked the end of German air superiority. In broader terms, the Thunderbolt also illustrated the evolution of warfare during World War II. It was a tool not just for destruction, but for the shifting strategic priorities that defined the war's final years. As the Allies honed their ability to launch precision attacks from the air, as well as protect their bombers with fighter escorts like the P-47, it became clear that the sky itself had become a battlefield in which victory was defined by who could strike first, who could adapt the quickest, and who could dominate the high altitudes where battle was no longer simply about speed and maneuverability, but also about endurance, power, and shock. In the end, the P-47 the Thunderbolt was a critical part of the Allied victory, helping to dismantle the Luftwaffe and contributing to the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany. But beyond its role in the war, the Thunderbolt represents a pivotal moment in history, a reminder of how technology, strategy, and human resolve come together to change the course of a conflict and, ultimately, the world. The Thunderbolt's roar, echoing from above the clouds, was a harbinger of the end of an era for the Luftwaffe. For those who lived through the terror it brought, it was a sound that signaled a shift in the tide of war, a moment when the heavens themselves seemed to open up to deliver judgment. And, as the war drew to its close, that sound faded into history, leaving behind a new understanding of what it meant to command the skies.